All right, so this is the final talk for WDW. It's going to be about deployment. And unlike most of the other talks you've probably been to, this talk won't have a lab component. So instead, I'm just going to be walking you through how to deploy your sites. And I'll be giving you some time throughout the talk to follow along and replicate some of the steps I've been doing. In case you haven't actually built a website, if you haven't attended any of the other talks and if you haven't built a website, then we have some starter code that can get you started and that you can deploy and follow along with. So in terms of the goals for today, the first thing I want to do is create a kind of intuitive understanding about how static sites are served on the WDW. And the important thing is we're going to be focusing on static sites, not dynamic sites. So if you attended the React or Node talks, I'll be mentioning in passing some options if you want to host API that you built with Node or React or Flask. But today we're mostly going to be focusing on basic static sites that have been built with HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript. So yeah, the second goal is to make the HTML, CSS, and JS you wrote this weekend public. And finally, we're going to implement some tools so you can better understand how users are behaving on your website. So before we begin, one of the things I want us to consider is basically how you visit the website. Like from a user facing point of view, how does the web work? How do you go about accessing your favorite website? So basically, most of us, when we access a website, we open up a browser, and then you probably enter some string of characters like ScottyLabs.org, and then you probably hit enter and wait for the site to appear. And this is pretty simple, and the web is really user-friendly because it doesn't take much to get started up with the web. But actually, in the background, a lot of things happen when you access a website. So actually, when a client enters what's called a URL to a browser, the browser ends up taking this URL and then splitting it up into a domain name, a protocol, and a path. So in this case, the domain name would be ScottyLabs.org. The protocol would be HTTPS, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. And the path in this case is just not here, but what happens is the browser basically takes the domain name and then it sends it to what's called a DNS server. So a DNS server is kind of like a address book on the web, and it was basically implemented to make the web more user-friendly. And basically what happens is the DNS server takes this string, ScottyLabs.org, and then what it does is it looks through its directory and then returns an IP address. So basically it reads the domain name and tells you what IP address the web server that's linked to this domain name is. And then what your browser does is it basically sends an HTTPS request to this IP. So basically, if you don't know, an IP is basically how we address different computers on the internet. So after it gets the IP, it sends a request to a web server that's at that IP. And then that web server basically gets the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and all files that you've written for your website from its hard drives, and then returns it back as raw files to your browser. And then finally, your browser basically renders all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then shows you a pretty website like this. So this is what's going on in the background, and it might seem like a lot of different new terms. We don't really need to worry about it, but it's important to understand just the sequence of steps so that we can replicate it when we're deploying. And in terms of specific definitions for DNS servers and web servers, we'll get to them a little bit later on. But for now, this is just like a high-level overview of what happens in the background when you access websites. So now we'll move on to deploying our site. So looking back at the high-level overview of the web, it's pretty clear that we need to work backwards. So basically, we need to start off by hosting our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files on a web server. And then we need to map our web server's IP address to a domain name like ScottyLabs.org or like cmu.edu. And then finally, we need to test it and make sure that everything works from the client perspective. So firstly, when we take a look at hosting files on a web server, in terms of knowing what a web server is basically an internet connected device that's always listening for HTTP requests. So technically a web server can be a computer on the cloud. It can be a laptop or a desktop. It just needs to be a computer that's always listening to HTTP requests coming to it. And this can be done by special software. So usually when we're configuring a web server, we have to set up some special software so that it's always listening to HTTP requests. So in terms of deploying our site on a web server, we have a few options. So the first option is to just take a laptop or a PC or set up a server and make it a web server, basically. So this is quite a difficult option because you have to set up the hardware and you also have to set up the software to make it listen to HTTP requests that it's getting via the web. And also, this is a little bit difficult, and this is a little bit complex in terms of making sure that it's always accessible and also making sure that it's always up. The second option is to rent and configure a cloud server, and this is usually referred to as infrastructure as a service. So what happens in this case is you basically pay a company like DigitalOcean or Google Cloud Platform or Amazon Web Services, and then you basically get a certain amount of computing power from their data centers. And then since the hardware is already configured, all you need to do is configure the actual software component that listens to HTTP requests, and then your website should be running. But the final option is, which is what we're going to be using today, is basically using a pre-configured web server. And these are services called platform as a service. And some options are Netlify and Heroku, and you might have heard of them. And in this case, it's really simple because both the hardware and the software are already configured. So in terms of actually getting things up and running, it's really simple. So specifically, we'll be using a platform as a service called Netlify. And the reason we're going to be using Netlify is because everything we need is pre-configured on Netlify. And it also has a really easy to use web-based graphical user interface. So we won't be needing to code anything else to get everything up and running. And finally, it's really reliable and scalable because unlike if we set up our own server in our basement or something, Netlify is a big company. They have a lot of servers running, and they have close to 99% uptime. And finally, it's free. There are a few caveats to that in terms of limited bandwidth and also in terms of limited features, but it's going to be perfectly fine to get your first static website up and running. All right, so I'm going to start showing you guys how you can get your site hosted on Netlify. You can follow along, but I'll also give you some time after the short demo so you can try and replicate what I've done. There are some, so in case you haven't gone to any of the other talks, and in case you haven't built a static website of your own that you want to deploy, you can access some starters code from href.scottylabs.org/deployment. Yeah, so there's a small static website that has some CSS and HTML that you can use if you don't have anything to deploy. And I'll be deploying this. So it's basically just a one-page simple website that we're going to be using. All right, so let's get started. First, you need to go to netlify.com, and you can create an account from here. All right, so I already have an account. I'm going to be signing in with GitHub. All right, so once you sign in, this is what you should see. There are a few options once you reach this point. So one option is to import sites from Git. So if you already have your site integrated with Git, and if it's on remote on GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket, you can integrate it here, and it's going to be continuously deploying from the remote. So basically, every time you push your code to that remote, it'll automatically deploy on Netlify. But for today, we're going to keep things simple, and we're going to just drag and drop our code. So basically, what you need to do is get the folder that contains your static site files, and the folder basically that contains the index.html. And all you need to do is drag and drop. Then it's going to deploy. So once it's deployed, it's going to basically show up here. and this link should lead you to your site. And then if we go into site settings, we can change the site name. So if I change this to WDW, then your site should be accessible on www.netlify.app. All right. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to give you guys, let's say 8 minutes to get your site deployed on Netlify, and ask any questions in the chat if you have any. All right, so we're going to start with the slides again. If you couldn't get your site up and running on Netlify, don't worry. You can ask questions later on, or you can come to office hours, which is happening right after this talk. Yeah, so at this point, we have our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript hosted on a web server, and you should be able to access your site from anywhere. So if you go on your phone or another browser, it shouldn't be a problem. You should be able to access your site using the name you set up on Netlify with the .netlify.app suffix. But as you can imagine, the link isn't perfect. It's difficult to remember, and it's bad for search engine optimization and marketing because you have that netlify.app component. So because of that, what we're going to do is we're going to map our Netlify site to a custom domain name. So instead of it being www.netlify.app, we're going to make it whatever we want, like with most other websites like ScottyLabs.org or like cmu.edu. So before we can do that, it's important that we understand what domain names are and what domain name servers are and how they work, basically. So firstly, in terms of looking at what is a domain name is basically just a string of characters used to identify a web server. And basically, the whole concept of domain names and DNS servers was basically introduced back in the late 1990s when the web was being developed in order to make the user experience really friendly and to make it so that people don't have to remember a lot of long IP addresses. So actually, you can think of domain names and domain name servers kind of like the contacts app on your phone, in the sense that it basically maps a bunch of long numbers that are actually used to identify different web servers to a database of, to basically a string of characters called a domain name that's much easier to remember and that's much easier to, for us as humans to use. So a domain name server is basically a server that has a database of domain names and corresponding IPs. And once you send it a domain name like ScottyLabs.org, it translates the domain name to an IP address that we can actually use to access a web server. So you don't need to actually worry about what these requests look like. All you need to know is that there's this thing called a DNS server, and that there's this thing called a domain name. And a DNS server takes a domain name and it responds with an IP address that we can then access the web server with. So you might be wondering how are domain names assigned? Like, for example, you wouldn't want a domain name to be owned by two different people. For example, if you have facebook.com, you don't want it to be pointing to two different IP addresses. How would you make it so that the directory of domain names, the domain name server, is properly maintained and properly managed and up to date? And all of this is done by this organization called ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And these guys basically handle all of the IP address mapping and the DNS servers. But you might have also heard of companies like Namecheap or GoDaddy. And these companies are basically just private domain registrars that let you rent a domain for around $10 a year. So what these guys do is they make you pay $10 and then you get the domain name you want as long as it's available. And then they'll reserve that domain name for you on the domain name servers for a year. So specifically, we'll be using Namecheap, and we'll actually not be using the main Namecheap site, but this subsite called nc.me, which is like Namecheap's education offering. And the reason we'll be using Namecheap is because all major domain registrars aren't too different. And whether you use Namecheap or whether you use GoDaddy, it's not really going to be make that big of a difference. The feature set is pretty similar. But specifically, we'll be using Namecheap because students get a free .me domain name for a year from this nc.me site. So before we can actually move on to going to Namecheap and buying a domain, getting our free domain name, it's important to spend some time looking at how we can actually pick a good domain name, because a domain name is important because it's basically the gateway to your website, basically, because everyone's going to be using the domain name to access your website. So it's important that you keep your domain name relevant and simple, but it's also important that you keep your domain name unique, because in terms of search engine optimization, which is basically how high up the search results your website shows up, and in terms of branding, picking a good domain name that's unique will ensure that your site is more marketable and more accessible via search engines. And then the domain name should also be easy to pronounce and spell. This is kind of similar to branding and marketing. And one way to do this is to avoid hyphens and repeated letters, because they're confusing and they're difficult to communicate verbally. All right, so these are basically some pointers. There's a lot more that you can think about, but these should be good enough for us to get started. So now we'll be configuring our domain name. So let me move into Namecheap. Yeah, all right, so you need to go to nc.me, and then you should see the site Namecheap for Education. So all you need to do is type in the domain name you'd like. So for example, if I type in WebDev Weekend, so if it's available, it should show up here. And then we see here that webdevweekend.me is free and we can add it. They also have some other domain names like .io, .tech, .com, and you're welcome to pay for these if you'd like, but for now we're going to be using the .me domain names. And once you click on add, you can complete your order here. And you're going to have to select the GitHub Pages option and then enter your student email. So your student email needs to have a .edu or .ac or something like that. And then if it's a verified student email, it's going to basically email you a link to your email. And then once you click that link, you should be able to create an account on Namecheap's main website. And then you should have the domain you selected in your Namecheap account. So I've already done this. So I'm just going to log in. So once you do the domain name registration on nc.me, you'll be accessing and working with your domain name on Namecheap. And you'll create an account once you enter your email. It'll basically send you a link, and then using that link, you'll be able to create an account. All right, so I have this domain name, ScottyLabs.me, and this is basically the dashboard you should see on Namecheap once you log in. So we're gonna click on Manage. And once we click on Manage, over here under Name Servers, you should see Namecheap Basic DNS. So basically what at the first point of configuration, your DNS is going to be configured to use name servers used by Namecheap. In terms of what name servers are, you don't really need to worry about it, but it's basically related to the concept of DNS servers. But in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to be using netlify as our name server. So this allows us to use netlify to customize our domain name and add subdomains and do anything we'd like with the domain name we just got for ourselves. So the way you do this is you go back into netlify, and then you can go to your home dashboard by clicking on the top left. And then there should be this menu item called domains. And then once you go here, you can add or register domain. So you enter your domain name. So for example, ScottyLabs.me. And then it'll say ScottyLabs.me already has an owner. Is it you? Yes. You can continue here. And then it's going to give you this list of name servers. So then what you need to do is go back into Namecheap and then copy paste these name servers into these text fields. So you need to keep adding name servers and then copy pasting these different name servers. So once you do this, it's going to take some time to propagate the changes across all the different domain servers, the DNS servers there are on the internet. So it might take a few hours to get the DNS working properly. So in my case, I've already done this. So I have my ScottyLabs.me DNS set up on Netlify, and I have my Namecheap pointing to those correct name servers. So now that I have my domain name set up, I can go back into my site, which I set up, and I can basically go into domain settings and then click on add custom domain. And then in here, you type in your domain name. And then once you do this, you should be able to access your site. Yeah. So now when I go to ScottyLabs.me, I see the site we deployed. But notice that it says not secure here. So this is because the site is being accessed through HTTP, not HTTPS. So what this basically boils down to is that the communication between the browser and the server is not encrypted. So because of that, it says not secure. So in order to get the site to be encrypted and in order to move to HTTPS, we need to install what's called the SSL certificate. And it's really easy with Netlify because it uses a service called Let's Encrypt, which basically automatically generates free SSL certificates. And then the good thing about Netlify is it automatically also updates the SSL certificates when it expires. So we can click on verify DNS configuration here. And then we should be able to access our site. It might take some time. Right, so we'll check back later on it. It might take some time to get the SSL certificate ready, but we have our domain name set up. So I'm not going to pause at this point because it takes some time to get the actual domain name working, and getting it pointing to the correct name servers takes time to propagate. So you can try that out after the talk, and you can come to office hours later on if you have any questions. All right, so at this point, our static site is now public, and anyone can access it using the domain name we set up. So in this case, it was ScottyLabs.me. But you still might have some questions in terms of the engagement with your website. So for example, you might want to know whether people are accessing your site, and if so, where are they accessing it from? How long are they accessing the content for? And yeah, so you might want to know what pages they're visiting, how long they're staying on the page for. All of these questions are important when it comes to developing a website and making sure that your website is successful in reaching the masses. So the solution to this is basically to integrate analytics, which is basically a tool that allows you to track how people are interacting with your website. So we'll be using a tool called Google Analytics. And the reason we'll be using Google Analytics is because it's very easy to implement, like all the other tools and services we've used so far in this talk. And Google Analytics also gives you a ton of useful data. It's probably going to be difficult to find out what each of the different data points actually mean, but there's a lot of good documentation and there's a lot of useful data that you can get via Google Analytics. And the other thing is it's free, and that's important as well. All right, so let's integrate with Google Analytics. All right, so the first thing you need to do is you need to move out of your CMU account, because the CMU G Suite account actually blocks you from using Google Analytics, but you should be able to use Google Analytics from a personal Google account. So once you switch to your personal Google account, you need to go to analytics.google.com. And this will likely take you to some landing page because you haven't set Google Analytics up yet. But if you have Google Analytics, this is what it should look like. And all you need to do is basically go into this portion called admin. and then you need to create a property. So once you do that, you can specify what type of application or service you want to integrate analytics with. So Google Analytics works with web apps, websites, mobile apps. So in this case, we'll be using Google Analytics with just a static website. So we're going to click on web and then continue. And then you need to give your website a name. So I'm going to call it WDW. And then you have to enter your website URL.
You're sharing your entire screen.
All right. Can you see everything now?
Yeah, now we can.
All right. So once you reach analytics, let me just start up again. All right. So you go to analytics.google.com. And what you'll end up seeing is probably going to be different from this. It's going to be a landing page saying something like get started with analytics or something. And then once you click on that, you should get to a point where you can create a property. But if you already have analytics set up, basically you go on this admin section, and then you can create a property from here. And once you reach this, like I said, Google Analytics works with web apps, websites, mobile apps. So in this case, we'll be using a website. So continue. And then you have to give your website a name. So we'll call it WDW. And you have to give your website's URL. So this is where your domain name goes. So ScottyLabs.me. Then you can select industry category. So education. And then you select your time zone. All right. And then hit create. All right, so once you do that, it should take you to this section called tracking info, and then move you to the section called tracking code. So the way Google Analytics works is it basically gives you some JavaScript, this bit of JavaScript. And what you need to do is basically put this JavaScript in the head portion of all of the HTML files that you want to be tracked. And then once you do that, it should start feeding in data into Google Analytics. So if I just select this, so this is the code for the site. Inside the head, I'm just going to paste this in. So since this is a one-page site, I don't need to copy this multiple times, but if your website has multiple HTML files, then you'll need to copy this into all of the pages that you want to track. All right, so once I've saved that, I can go back into netlify and redeploy. So I actually forgot to show you this in the beginning, but if you want to make changes to your site and redeploy, it's really simple. All you need to do is just drag and drop again. So WDW. Yeah. So you go into deploys and then you drag and drop. And then it should be published. All right. So now if I go into ScottyLabs.me, yeah, so the Let's Encrypt certificate is working now. And if I inspect, as you can see, our script for Google Analytics is in there. And this is going to start feeding in data to Google Analytics. So again, we can go back to see all our website data from the site name we just configured by clicking on the drop-down menu here. And then we can click on the home. Yeah, so now it registers the one real-time user that I've activated here. And you can see a bunch of information about the people visiting your website in terms of like what country they're coming from. And you can also see things like over time, you can measure a bunch of things. You can also search different phrases here, and it uses some natural language processing to try and answer questions you have about how people are accessing your site and how people are engaging with your content, which is pretty useful. All right. Let me go back to the slides. So you can try integrating with Google Analytics now. I can give you maybe 10 minutes. All right, so I think we can start again with the slides. And if you guys have any questions, we can address them at the end of the talk. Let me share my screen again. All right, so at this point, we have our site running on ScottyLabs.me. And we have the HTTPS configured using the Let's Encrypt SSL certificate. And you should be able to access this site from anywhere, basically. And we also have Google Analytics integrated, so we can see when people are accessing our site and learn more about how much time they're spending on our site and what kind of content they're interacting with. All right. So basically, we have our HTML, CSS, JavaScript hosted on Netlify, which we're using as a web server. We have our site accessible via our custom domain from Namecheap. And like I said, we have real-time data on usage and engagement from Google Analytics. So this is pretty much what I wanted to get done for today. But in case you want to know how you can deploy a dynamic site. So firstly, if you don't know what a dynamic site is, basically a dynamic site is just a web app or a website that has interactive elements, or if it has changing information. So most websites that you use today are probably dynamic in the sense that they pull information from some API or some databases, and then they show it to you dynamically. So these types of sites are a little bit more complicated to deploy in the sense that usually these sites have what's called a backend and a front end. And the front end deployment is pretty much the same to what we did. You might have to go through a few more steps on Netlify because in order to get the front end web app running, because it needs to call the databases and APIs and get the information that you might need on your dynamic site. But the more challenging part is actually getting the backend running. So in order to do that, we have a few options once again. So I'm not going to go over the first option. Well, it's not even included here. You can, like with the web server, like with the traditional static website, you can set up a laptop or server in your basement and use that as your server to host the dynamic site. But it's not the best solution. So the first real option is basically using a platform as a service like Netlify or Heroku. And the good thing with this, as we've just seen, is it's fast, free, and easy to set up. But the second option, which I'd recommend, is basically using infrastructure as a service, which is basically using AWS, GCP, or DigitalOcean. And in this case, it's better to learn this because it's the de facto approach in industry. And it's also a great learning experience because you'd be learning how to work with Linux servers and how to get, how to configure different languages and packages that you need on those servers, and then get your actual dynamic site running on it. So it's a good option, and there's a lot of great documentation to get started. So if you do have a dynamic site and you want to get it up and running fast, then Netlify or Heroku. But if not, you can use DigitalOcean, AWS, or GCP. And actually, there's this thing called the GitHub Student Pack, where you can use your .edu email, and it gives you like a bunch of free software. And the GitHub Education Pack has $50 free DigitalOcean credit, which can get you up and running for a few months on DigitalOcean. So that's about it for today's talk. I have some additional resources linked on the slides in terms of the Netlify documentation, the GitHub Student Developer Pack, some documentation with Google Analytics. It might have been a bit fast in terms of the walkthrough. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Feel free to put it in the chat or just unmute and ask, basically.